So I'm going to talk about, for a slightly shorter period of time now, where can we go on rebreathers that we can't go on open circuit? And yes, that's what we're going to talk about. So I've been diving. Just a little bit about me. Probably most of you don't know me. This is my first trip to Florida. I have two lives. One life I'm an anaesthesiologist and work in diving and hyperbaric medicine. The other job that I'd like to be doing is going cave diving and taking movies and photographs for large amounts of time. I've been diving for about 30 years, but my passion for diving has really taken a new hold with the innovation of widely available rebreather technology. So what we're going to talk about is how rebreathers work in exploration diving, and exploration usually involves an expedition to go somewhere. An expedition is defined as a journey that's undertaken by a group of people with a particular purpose. For example, an expedition into the jungles of the Orinoco. There's a second shorter definition, which is that it can be a short trip made for a particular purpose, like a shopping expedition, like we did yesterday to the outlet malls. Now, anyone who believes that to be the correct definition of the term should immediately leave the auditorium. By definition, expeditions involve some added problems and complexities. They are in, by definition, remote locations. They're often hard to get to. It may be difficult to communicate to the outside world from remote locations, which means there's a great need for self-sufficiency when you're in these locations, and that covers all aspects of what you're doing there, including living and sleeping and eating and cooking. But you need to also think about medical problems and disaster management planning, how you're going to get a sick or injured diver out of the site should that become necessary. Transportation into some of these locations, which I'll go on to show you, is often difficult as well, and often we have to travel very light, particularly if you're using things like helicopters, which you tend to pay by the minute as you're going into the sites. Now, this was the first video, which I'll reenact now. This is a helicopter flying into the Pearse Resurgence and landing by the beautiful river there. You get an aerial view looking down. There's a cargo net underneath the helicopter. Whoop, there it goes. They're dropping the rope from underneath. Can you see that? Yes. And you'll see us unloading all the equipment, 4 or 5 tonnes of equipment into a remote New Zealand river. Did you get a sense of that? These are some of the places in Australia where we're actively cave diving at the moment. The colours are all strange, are they? Yes, the colours are all wrong. So that's a big brown country called Australia with red circles on it and a little yellow dot where I live. The big red circle, which may appear to be a slightly sort of hypoxic blood-stained sort of dark blue colour, is the Nullarbor Plain. And what I was going to cunningly do with the next slide is show how Florida, this amazingly beautiful part of the world which is full of caves, how this is going to now, with this video slide, you can see Florida up in the top right corner, that is going to magically fly down and fit almost exactly into the Nullarbor Plain. Now, the point of that slide is to say that Florida, which has a population, I gather, of close to about 20 million people, which is roughly the same as the Australian landmass, about 20 million, covers an area of about 66,000 square miles. And the Nullarbor Plain is roughly the same size. It's about 77,000 square miles and has a population. Well, I tried to add up the people in the few towns there, and I got to about 350 people, but there must be a couple of thousand people living there out and about. But the point being that not only is it a very rich area for cave diving, it's the largest limestone slab, single slab in the world, in fact. But it is truly, you get a sense of real isolation when you're out there, because you're in a place the size of Florida with only a few hundred people there. So you may be aware, we may not even get to talk about rebreathers at this rate, but you may be aware that between Australia and New Zealand there is a little bit of very friendly rivalry. And it's sad to say, but it's true to say, there are many fantastic things that have come out of New Zealand. At the top of the photo there is a long-distance galloper called Far Lap, which is widely recognised, certainly down our way, to be one of the greatest racehorses of all time. All my life I thought that was an Australian racehorse until I started doing some research for this talk. Ernest Rutherford, one of the grandfather of nuclear physics at the top left, he actually came from a little town called Nelson, which is one of the great caving areas of the South Island of New Zealand. Also, I thought he was an Australian until recently. I'm still not convinced that the pavlova, that meringue and cream-filled cake on the bottom right, I'm sure that's Australian, but Wikipedia and all these sources tell me that it was invented in New Zealand, and so on it goes. So forever we're trying to claim all this Kiwi stuff as our own, but there is one exception. All right, rebreathers. And the talk's nearly finished. We're mainly here to talk about safety, and I, of course, take all that stuff very seriously. It's important, though, to look at the other end of the envelope, some of the stuff that we're doing on rebreathers, which is arguably not as safe as it could be, but to find the limits or the envelope of rebreather diving is actually very important to know, because it tells the rest of us what we can safely achieve on rebreathers. In the same way that open circuit divers like to swim down a shot line and pull off a peg at the deepest point and return to the surface with extremely high risk to their lives, whilst most of us would think that a foolhardy and reckless endeavour, it gives us some very important information about what the limits of such diving is. And I would never encourage anyone to attempt depth records or records of any kind for a record's sake. Just to look back though, when rebreather diving perhaps first started from a technical diving point of view, I think from what I can understand that probably an oxygen rebreather dive in Wookie Hole was the first technical rebreather dive performed, recreational rebreather dive, and unfortunately probably also the site of the first rebreather death, but it was a lot easier than walking through those sumps in standard dress, I imagine. I'm very glad that I got a moment to say hello and introduce myself to Bill Stone and Richard Pyle at lunchtime before I started to talk about them and their contribution to this sport. But in fact, this rebreather, the prototype Cis Luna and everything that followed really did change the way I think the world has looked at rebreather diving, and Richard has contributed equally significantly to that. And to their credit, both those guys have published so widely about what they've done with these units that we've all got to hear about it and learn about it. And certainly this stuff is what brought rebreather diving to my attention, and I voraciously read everything I could about Bill Stone's endeavours, in particular being interested in cave diving. And just to remind you what Bill did and with the unit, and I hope I don't misrepresent him at all, but at a point where they were exploring this very deep dry cave and had reached a sump, they had also reached the limits of open circuit diving with the very lightweight high pressure composite cylinders that they were carrying. And you can imagine carrying scuba equipment down a 1400 metre dry cave involves a massive manpower and massive logistics. So when you finally get down to the sump, you want to have every opportunity to do the maximal amount of exploration. And they had reached the limit of what they could really sensibly carry down to the sump and start diving. So Bill built this amazing rebreather, which was fully redundant with its systems, and they went on to successfully explore that sump. And 600 metres of their exploration was through a sump, the depth of around 30 metres, and the longest dive over an hour and a half. And the amazing thing about that, whilst that dive in itself is not so spectacular apart from the location of the dive, is that only 1,400 litres of oxygen and about 2,500 litres of heliox were consumed, which is absolutely nothing, a couple of cylinders worth. And I think this should be compulsory reading, not just for rebreather divers, but for all scuba divers, because of Bill's ability to take an engineer's approach to look at failure points and failure analysis of complex systems like this. And presumably he used this thought process to design and build his fully redundant or dual redundant rebreather system. Now these nodal probability schematics where he looks at each failure point along the way, and if one thing fails, is there a way around it? This is my doctor's sort of understanding of an engineering principle. He applies in this paper to every type of scuba apparatus, including a single tank scuba through to manifolded scubas and scuba tanks and so forth. Now I myself was an engineer of note, and like Bill, I took to building rebreathers in my shed also. And this was the Harry Breather Mark II, which was made from a variety of components from the hardware store, some stolen anaesthetic equipment, and the Drager Ray, which is, as we all know, the home builder's friend. That performed 2 to 3 swimming pool dives before it was dismantled and the individual components hidden in various parts of the house so that it could never come together and act as a complete machine again. But I feel that probably Martin Parker's inspiration was somewhat inspired by this unit, and you can probably see the design features that are that are similar. And Rick Stanton takes this sort of endeavour to another level again with his beautifully named hardware store apparati, like the Bagpipes of Doom, and another one that's called the Wing and the Prayer. And actually, one thing I want to have a talk to Bill about is, if he had his time again in that Mexican cave, would he take something more like this? Because he could probably put 10 of them in one bag and take them all down with him. Or would he still use a complex and fully redundant system like he's done? Because something like the KISS Rebreather, I think, has changed the way that a lot of us might think about that kind of exploration. I'll have to wait till we're at the bar tonight to ask him. So just to look at some numbers, what have people achieved on rebreathers? And when I say achieved, I mean how far down have they gone? So this information is all from the internet, so please sing out if I've got some numbers wrong or if there's something that can be updated. But the deepest cave dive on Rebreather at the moment was the Rebreather dive that David Shaw performed in Bushman's Hole in South Africa. As we all know, the subsequent dive to the same depth had a fatal outcome. There was a recent shotline dive I think it was in the Red Sea by Krzysztof Stanowski, using twin hammerhead rebreathers, dual hammerheads to 283 metres. The longest cave traverse in this part of the world, as you all know, on a passive semi-closed rebreather by the WKPP team, over 11 kilometres, and a massive duration underwater using habitats for decompression. The longest sump is now this amazing sump in Pozo Azul in Spain, done by the British cave diving team with John Valanthan and Rick Stanton and Jason Mellison, which is over 5 kilometres for a single sump. The deepest sump ever passed to air, which is actually an incredibly challenging thing to accomplish if you think about it. You're going down, 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 and then get to 100 metres and you start going up and you're having to do decompression. At some point you have to commit yourself to keep going up and then basically repeating the whole dive if you don't reach air, or if you do reach air, you've got to deco out to the surface. So the deepest sump to be passed is about 100 metres, which is the first of 4 sumps in that cave that have now been passed. And the deepest wreck dive, the Milano, 236 metres on Rebreather. So it seems that the 200 metre range is the range where the deeper dives are being done at this stage. And there's no question that the risks to the individuals increase exponentially at these depths. So one question I'm going to ponder towards the end of this talk is, what is the current depth limit and where will this finish up? So to just look at a couple of the expeditions that I've been involved in over the last few years, most cave divers around the world have probably heard of Cocklebiddy Cave. It's certainly our most famous cave. It's kind of analogous to Ginny Springs in terms of how popular it is to visit or to think about at least. It's out on that Nullarbor plain that I showed you on the map on the big green map of Australia, and it's certainly a very remote place. Nullarbor, as you probably know, stands for no trees, and there's no question that it's appropriately named. That's Craig Challen standing over a star dropper which marks the first air chamber, which is about 800 metres, which is, 3,000 feet into the cave. So there's 3 sumps basically with 2 air chambers in the middle and an overall length of about 6 kilometres, or a bit over 6 kilometres. It's a very beautiful place, despite the fact that there's absolutely nothing there and it's like a big brown billiard table. I find the Nullarbor an extraordinarily attractive and beautiful place, especially at night time, when you get these amazing electrical storms or beautiful sky with all the stars. Now, this, to me, summarises why you can do things with open circuit, but you no longer need to. And if you think about the 1983 push, sorry about the colour, the 1983 push in which Hugh Morrison laid some line at the end of the cave. The French had been, the Australians had gone a little way, and then the French came over and snuck into our cave and went a bit further and said, no, we cannot stand for that. So these guys went back the next year and took as many cylinders as they could find. And one of those tanks, I'm proud to say, was my 72-litre aluminium tank that I bought soon after my course. So they took all these cylinders out there and tied them all together and dragged them through the cave, and used these big sleds with built-in buoyancy control. And over a period of time, they used this equipment and this many divers, 4 sleds, and spent 55 hours underground to add a few hundred metres to the third sump of the cave. Their underwater time was 11 hours, and they reached just over 6 kilometres. Now compare that with the streamlined efficiency and attractive nature of those 2 divers who essentially repeated the same dive a few years ago without the need for that massive infrastructure. Of course, when Craig and I went back to try and add a bit of line to the end of Hugh Morrison's, or actually to Chris Brown's line, all the hard work has been done, the line's been laid for us in front of us. But regardless, we could go out there with 3 rebreathers between us, 4 small scooters with lithium batteries, and about 8 open circuit cylinders in the cave. Underwater time of about 9.5 hours, and underground time only 19 hours. And about 120 metres of line laid by Craig at the end of the cave. So yes, you can still do it on open circuit, and there are divers still going out there and camping in the second air chamber, and doing all this on open circuit. But it seems that rebreathers have perhaps changed that. Unfortunately, there is a price to pay for technology, and whilst we're developing our own lithium-ion batteries for our scooters to do these dives, we've found that they're also very combustible, and if you put them on the roof rack of the car and they rub together on the way home, then the result is a burnt-out Nissan Patrol. To the left of the screen on the floor, that sort of white and black smudge is a Mark 15.5 rebreather that I used to own. And there's also some nice camera equipment in small aluminium puddles on the floor there. But Ken Smith in the background, who many of you know, a regular visitor to the Florida caves, he said, thank God I didn't have any insurance, because all that paperwork's a real pain. So just before I did that Cocklebiddy expedition, I was lucky enough to be invited by a guy called Paul Hosey, who's a very enthusiastic Australian cave explorer, to visit a cave that they'd just found in the Kimberleys, which is in the very northwest of the whole country. And it's a truly remote place. There's no way to get to this site by road or even by foot. The only way in is from a small Aboriginal settlement called Warnham by helicopter. Helicopters are there because they take tourists to fly around the Bungle Bungles, which is that sort of beehive range, as you may have heard of. So this site called Kidja Blue, Kidja is the name of the local Aboriginal people, is in the middle of the Kimberleys, and basically had been dived, there's the map, so had been dived by one guy who lived up there. He took a single tank in there. He saw this from his own plane, I think, and then hired a helicopter, went in there, did just a single tank air dive in the lake, and thought it was so beautiful and so special that he swore he would never tell anyone about it. Well, fortunately, his niece was a local caver, and over a period of about 3 years, she kind of got the information out of him that there was a cave there, and Paul went back and hired a plane and sort of mowed the lawn with this plane back and forth for about 3 days, until on about the last 10 minutes of the last flight, he actually spotted the thing and whacked it in the GPS. So this place is reached only by helicopters. Now, as I mentioned, as soon as you turn on the motor for a helicopter, you start paying, and you get your wallet out, and it's a very unpleasant business. So this was the first time we'd done any helicopter diving, and we were so frightened about how much it was going to cost that we decided to take the absolute bare necessities, including, horrible freeze-dried food and no water, and assumed we could drink the water and all this sort of stuff. That's a picture of the helicopter with a couple of big oxygen cylinders strapped to the side, Vietnam style. And so we camped there for about 11 days, doing it pretty rough, but the most spectacular place. And there's just no way we could have taken enough equipment and cylinders in there to dive this cave with open circuit. And as it turned out, the cave turned out to be magnificent, and that's a shot from me hanging on the abseil rope into the entrance of the cave, looking down into this big crescent-shaped lake, which is about 350 foot long, like your own private lap pool. And truly glorious place to visit. lots of chambers within chambers underneath the thing, and quite a complex three-dimensional structure. But basically, flowing down the hill, this thing is a perched water table, and it fills up in the wet season, and then during the dry season it slowly leaches out the bottom down to a spring further down the hill, which you can see, where is it, the arrow that says approximate extent of deep cave passage. Just near there, there's a little wet soak where the water slowly comes out over the course of the dry season. So a very beautiful spot, and the first experience we had with this sort of helicopter diving. Now, once you've done helicopter cave diving, there's no going back. You're completely addicted. So enter the Pearse Resurgence, our next helicopter diving project. Now, the Pearse Resurgence is a cave that I'm very tangled up with, I guess, emotionally and certainly financially now, after having started going there in 2007 with another well-known Australian cave diver called David Appley, who did a huge amount of exploration in this cave. And I was lucky that he invited me, or I invited myself to go with him, but that doesn't matter. And so I went there in 2007. Now, the Pearse Resurgence is in an area known as the Mount Arthur Ranges on the South Island, near Ernest Rutherford's house in Nelson. And it's very famous for its very tall vertical caves, probably not tall by Bill Stone standards, but certainly tall for the Southern Hemisphere. And there are caves that are up to 1,000 metres now in vertical height. And just around the corner from one of these caves, called Nettlebed Cave, is the Pearse Resurgence. And the whole place is metamorphosed limestone, that is marble, and freshwater Vauclusian spring, which means it wells up from deep underground, and it sits at about 300 metres elevation, and the only way to get in there is with a helicopter. So once again, we're looking at deep diving with open circuit, perhaps, which would mean a lot of gas, and it has been done. In fact, David Dulett and Chris Brown did an amazing expedition there for us and explored cave down to over 120 metres, I think, on open circuit. But I think David would agree that, you know, the amount of time spent mixing gas and the amount of gas they would have had to take in was a little bit prohibitive. And certainly once we started to push past that 125 metre depth, then I just don't think we could contemplate it on open circuit. The other big problem with this cave is not only was it becoming very deep, but it's also very cold, about 43 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 or so degrees Celsius, and that's in the middle of summer. It probably doesn't get any colder in winter, I don't know, but it's certainly covered in snow everywhere else outside the cave, so we're not going there in winter. The depth as of last January, when we've just been there again, was actually 221 metres, not 212, which I would suggest would be the deepest cold water cave in the world at this stage. And the problems of diving deep in a cold water site like this are pretty self-explanatory, particularly with issues concerning CO2 and scrubber durations and all these sorts of problems. The top of the map is snipped off, I'm sorry, but it's virtually at the surface there. You dive into the entrance and down this shaft, the main shaft there, down to about 105 metres, and then you turn right on that map and go past what's known as the Big Room. Continues down the black line there to where you can see Rick Stanton's name. Rick was also on this trip in 2007 with Dave Appley and myself, and Rick did this amazing dive on his homemade side mount rebreather down to 177 metres and tied off his line, and only actually stopped at that point because the primary light, which belonged to me, imploded, and he had to turn around and come out. I went back the next year and pushed down just a very short distance down to the next level there at 182 metres. And then with Craig Challen and some other guys who have become collectively known as the Wet Mules, which is our little team, we've been going back to the cave and really trying to overcome the issue primarily of thermal protection in this site, as the dive times have started to stretch out from 3 to 4 to 5 to 7 to 10 to 12 hours in 6-degree water. And each year we've gone there, we've learnt more and more about how to look after our thermal protection, and Pollock's talk this morning was obviously of great interest to me. I can't wait for this aerogel stuff to appear and I can put on a whole suit of it. But as I say, I think this would be an impossible quest now on open circuit to be considering these sorts of depths. As I mentioned, there's obviously enormous gas savings for long and deep dives, which reduces our expenses from the helicopter point of view. The warming and humidifying effects on the rebreather are enormous. When you, for any reason, go off the rebreather onto open circuit, you feel the difference very rapidly indeed. It's quite unpleasant. The constant PO2 makes this much easier to do decompression calculations, particularly where you're not quite sure exactly what depth or time you're going to end up with. And obviously the decompression is much more efficient without those spikes that Simon showed on his graph this morning. In my mind, I'm actually not, I wouldn't call myself a rebreather advocate. I actually prefer diving on open circuit. Side mount open circuit cave diving is my favourite kind of diving, and I am a little fearful and certainly very suspicious of rebreathers, which is probably a good thing. But I tell you, when you're at depth or when you're in the overhead environment, it's extremely comforting having a rebreather, knowing that if a problem arises, you've got any amount of time to sort it out. So for me, that's the huge benefit for that technology. The other thing is just trying to mix gas between dives in this environment. Even with little 3-litre rebreather bottles, it takes forever. So to do it with open circuit would be unmanageable. Simon's mentioned the cost of helium in our part of the world. I think, Simon, you might be paying retail there, mate, if you're paying $1,000 a bottle, because I think it's more like $300 or $400 if you know the bloke at BOC in Nelson. But certainly the retail price is over $900 a cylinder. So without going into the details here, to do the open circuit dive to 185 metres that we did one year, nearly $1,500 just for the helium for a single dive on open circuit. The helium for the rebreather dive, about $70. And it doesn't include the savings on the helicopter, which are another few thousand if we had to take all the extra gas in. So there's no doubt that once you've paid off the loan on the rebreather, it starts to put you in front. Now, I'll just tell you a little bit about the logistics of how we're doing the dives in this site. In the top 40 metres of the cave, we've installed, or each time we reinstall 4 habitats, which are just the 1 cubic metre white transport containers. We call them intermediate bulk containers. They're used for detergents and pesticides and stuff like that. So give them a good clean out, turn them upside down in the cave and bolt them and tie them with ropes to put them in the cave. So we've got 4 of them, 1 at 40 metres, 1 at 28, 1 at 16 and 1 at 7 metres. Part of those depths is just the logistics of where they fit in the cave. Part is some decompression planning in mind. We're now using rebreathers in pretty much each of those habitats. So after the push dive, we come back to the first habitat at 40 metres, take off our main unit, enter the 40 metre habitat and put on or rest on our lap a stripped down KISS rebreather. So the cylinders are taken off, there's no wing or harness on it. We just rest it on our lap, put the loop on, and the cylinders are on long hoses hung underneath the habitat. When it's time to move up to the next habitat, we go back in the water, clip the rebreather off to a harness that we put on, and then clip off the 2 cylinders, and with a support diver at all times. That's a really important thing to emphasise with any sort of habitat manoeuvres, up to the next habitat. And so on up to the 16 metre habitat, where we're now using what we call the Wet Mule's Manbag CCR, but it's actually a rip-off of the thing called the Next Generation Rebreather, which many of you will have read about on Rebreather World. I'm sorry I can't the inventor of that, but it's basically a beautiful little simple rebreather made from a gas mask bag. And so we've adopted a couple of those for a closed circuit rebreather for the deeper habitats and an oxygen rebreather for the shallow habitat. Now this is a very exciting video that I'll reenact now of the habitats, and you're swimming down, you see the habitats with all the paraphernalia hanging below them. We've got surface supplied heating cables going down as far as 50 metres, and you can take those cables up with you all the way through the habitats, and we have radios in the top 2 habitats to talk to the surface, and we also have a buzzer box that Ken Smith invented for us that goes all the way down to 110 metres, and at every 20 or 30 metres you can press the buzzer and alert the surface to the fact that you're on your way up. It's particularly good for the surface to know when that first 110 metre buzzer goes off. Then we can start to quickly make a decompression calculation. We know roughly where the push diver is and when we can expect him up at the 40 metre habitat roughly. So that's started to work really well for us. All these push dives are done solo for the main reason that we feel that there's absolutely no way you can assist a second diver in distress at those depths. So I feel it's much safer actually by yourself. It's all relative, I guess. So that's the oxygen rebreather, and as I say, many of you will recognise that it's not our design, but it works beautifully well. And we just clip that to a hook on the roof of the habitat, and the loop just sits nicely in your mouth, and it's very light and comfortable. And I heard Martin Robson talking about habitats. The sitting in a habitat and breathing open circuit is dreadful because of the noise and the vibrations. It's really unpleasant. Sitting on your rebreather, you can be very comfortable. And that's the Manbag from 16 metres, which has got a shear water HUD on it, and we use that as the primary and only PO2 display, which is heresy, I guess, but it's very important that this is light and compact and just sits in your mouth with no fatigue. And I'm convinced that the decompression advantages of being warm and dry in a habitat are enormous, and in fact, in a tiny series, I guess, of about 15 or 16 dives between Craig and myself over and Dave and Sandy over 150 metres. We've not even had any niggles, which is certainly a lot better than our track record in the 100 to 120 metre range. Now, the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is just spend a bit of time talking about planning bailout for these kind of dives, which is a real issue, obviously, and Craig and I spend hours and hours and hours arguing back and forth the pros and cons of all the different possibilities for doing deep bailout, and it's worth this community just thinking a little bit about deep bailout options and pros and cons. We all accept that we need bailout, and particularly, well, for all dives, full stop. Given the limited duration of open circuit depth, the idea of a second or bailout rebreather is a very attractive one. And Craig has addressed this issue by twinning up his Megalodon rebreather, and thanks to Jacob from Golem Gear, he's now got a twin off as well, so flick of the switch and he can go back and forth between one loop and the other loop. It's a huge device. I'll show you some photos in a minute, but once he's got it on, it's pretty comfortable and works very well for him. Go on to your second rebreather. If there's a problem with the first, you don't have to change your decompression planning. You can pretty much carry on as normal. That's a photograph of his dual bailout valve, which again looks complex and frightening, but it's actually a very simple device and beautifully designed and made. Now, the problem with bailout rebreathers is that firstly, they need to work when they're required. They can't be flooded, and they have to have a breathable gas inside them. So that means that on the descent and during the dive, you have to do have a system to check your second rebreather throughout the dive. Now, that adds enormous complexity and task loading to an already stressful and difficult situation. So for those reasons, I've been a little bit nervous about embracing that technology, and I think having two rebreathers in a compact form on your back like Craig is probably a way to go if you're going to go down that path. You certainly need to have dived that configuration many, many times and be very comfortable where everything is before you contemplate doing any sort of deep diving. In fact, in this sort of environment, when you're in dry gloves and you're wearing very bulky and heavy undergarments, your mobility is very restricted. Any tiny change to your gear configuration needs to be rehearsed and practiced in shallow water before you take it anywhere else. It's amazing how the tiniest changes, one little hose or hose routing or a minor thing can cause things to become a little unstuck when you suddenly realise you can't reach it or you don't know where it is or it's had some other implication. I've made this little matrix for the way, this is about trying to win the argument with Craig basically, and why I believe that open circuit bailout is a better option for these dives. And the way I approach the concept is this, that I look at the likely possibilities of problems with the rebreather and whether they would make me required to bail out off the primary rebreather. And then secondly, whether if I did bail out off the primary rebreather, whether the rebreather would actually do what it needs to do, that is, give me breathable gas in a way that I can return to the surface safely. So looking at the common reasons why people might think about bailing out, if the primary loop floods, first of all, I consider that to be a rare event. It's an unlikely thing, although yes, it does happen from time to time. Do you have to bail out if you flood your loop? Well, yes, I think you definitely do. And if you've got a bailout rebreather, would bailing out onto it in that scenario be a successful manoeuvre? Well, if the rebreather's working fine, then yes, the second rebreather should be the option for bailout. The second problem is problems with the electronics. Again, with reliable electronics that we now have, the chances of a problem arising underwater, I've certainly had plenty of electronics problems before I've jumped in the water, which have made me have to abandon the dive. But once you're underway, it seems pretty rare that electronics problems arise. But if they do you have to bail out? Well, it depends on the problem, I guess, but usually you have some other options like going to a semi-closed mode or another way of managing the problem. But if you decided that you're unhappy and you wanted to bail out, well, the bailout rebreather, if it's working well, should solve that dilemma for you. If there's a problem with the gas supply of any kind, if the oxygen fails or runs out, or there's a problem with the solenoid sticking open and it spikes, again, there are other options you can approach that problem with, and you may not need to bail out, but if you do, the other rebreather should be working. Now, when we start to look at CO2 problems, it's becoming a little less clear to me what the answer is. If you had a problem with the scrubber, for example, a packing problem, some breakthrough, or you'd exhausted the scrubber material and you developed a CO2 problem, first of all, the likelihood of that sort of thing happening in this cold water, prolonged diving scenario is more than low, I think. In fact, we've had 1 or 2 minor CO2 incidents along these lines. Is bailing out mandatory? Well, yes, I feel it is mandatory to get off the loop. And if that happened, would the second rebreather solve the problem that you're experiencing? Well, Craig is adamant that if he detects it early enough, then yes, the second loop will fix that problem. I'm slightly less convinced that even early detection of CO2 because you've sensed it yourself, going onto a second rebreather may still be causing you some duress. I think that open circuit is a better option. Now, maybe that's just for a short period of time and then you can safely go onto the second loop, and that's a reasonable approach. So I've put maybe there for that one because you can probably argue both ways. The big worry that we've all got about this diving, and anyone who's been fortunate enough to hear Simon talk about the analysis of David Shaw's accident and this concept of independent respiratory insufficiency, will be aware that the deeper you go, the more likely this problem is that you yourself cannot clear CO2 from your body because of respiratory issues. And should that arise, yes, bailing out off the loop is mandatory, but going onto a second rebreather, I feel, and I think most people would agree, will definitely not solve the issue. You're changing the equipment, but the problem still resides within the diver. So I think that the only hope for resurrecting that problem, should you become a long way into that vicious cycle of difficulty breathing, is that you need to get onto open circuit and hope that that will break that cycle and ascend from depth to decrease the gas density, which will also improve things. And then if things have settled down, yes, you can go back onto the loop. So I looked at this and I thought, well, the biggest thing I'm frightened of in these deep cave dives is this problem of respiratory insufficiency. And I won't go into all the physiological details of that, obviously, now, but that was my greatest fear. And yet the bailout plan that we're talking about is a system that is not going to help in that particular scenario. So I felt that I needed to stick with open circuit bailout. This is the other video I was going to show you, some nice video of me laying line at 200 metres, which is would have been nice, but the things in this video that I wanted to show you were a couple of problems. Firstly, significant HPNS with shaking hands and difficulty doing simple things like tying off this reel, deploying my knife to cut the line, and the audio actually, to my anesthesiologist's ear, tells me that there's a little bit of the first hint of this effort-independent respiratory failure. That is, you can hear a pattern of respiration which is starting to head down that path. It's very, very subtle and very early, but you can certainly hear very loud banging closed of the flapper valves in the mouthpiece, which you don't hear at shallower depths from the gas density. And you can also hear the occasional prolonged expiration and little grunt at the start of each expiration. So you hear this sort of noise, which is just the start of this pattern that Simon's described so well. Anyway, that's for another day, I'm sorry. But it is, I'm happy to share that round for those who are interested. So just to finish up with a few pictures of rebreathers that we're using. So that's a picture of Craig's Megalodon from the back and the front. As you can see, it's a complex looking beast, and to help him dress into it, I just look at it and go, well, where is all the bits that you need? But he's spent an enormous amount of time on this unit and is very, very comfortable on it indeed now, and it works very well for him. Now, two of our other divers, Sandy Varren and Dave Barty, are both Revo divers, and they've approached the problem in a slightly unique way by putting an R2-D2 on the side of the unit. That's an inspiration taken out of its box and clamped to the side with a second loop sitting around with two separate loops with not a common bailout valve. And they've successfully dived that to 200 metres, and again, seems to work very well for them. Now, of course, I have to defend my position of planning on doing open circuit bailout at 200 metres, which is not an easy problem to do, and I'm not suggesting for a moment I've got it right, but if you do the maths on this, it's not very attractive at all, in fact. If we look at an 11 litre cylinder, which we pump up to 250 bar for these dives, we've got 240 bar cylinders. And if we assume, as someone said earlier, when you're having a crisis and you're actually planning to bail out, I normally plan for a swimming sack rate of, say, 20 litres per minute. I'm very confident it would be at least 40 litres per minute for a short period of time. It's all hitting the fan. So if you're breathing 40 litres per minute at 21 atmospheres, it works out to roughly 3 minutes per cylinder, with a bit left over that you can't get out of the tank because you're too deep. So I'm carrying 3, sometimes 4 cylinders for these dives, and the first one's plugged into the bailout valve, so at least I've got that one for 3 minutes. That's assuming the bailout reg works at that depth, which I'm not going to test just for experiment's sake. Gives me about 10 minutes to get back to the 150 metre stage tank, which on the scooter takes about 3 minutes if you just go for it. So I'm not pretending there's any margin of safety there whatsoever, but I do believe that it will give me an option in case of this respiratory insufficiency problem. We've tried staging rebreathers in the cave, and we should have listened to Rick Stanton's advice in that he was correct saying that they always flood. If you sit there and leave them switched off, they just gradually flood. And some cave divers have recently found that out to their cost. So my unit is just a straightforward Revo, basically with the two 20 amp hour light battery packs on the sides, which I plug into 2 bulkheads in my suit for my heating garments, and an argon cylinder on the side, which we are still persisting with, despite minimal evidence for its efficacy. But I figure the placebo effect is as good as any effect if you're bloody cold, so we'll stick with that for a bit. Side-mounted KISS, which a friend of mine and I have put together, was my original bailout plan, but as I say, I've gone away from that idea. So I'm just going to finish up by just talking a little bit about the future of rebreathers for this kind of diving. There's no doubt that rebreathers are going to become more efficient, more reliable, better self-checks, automatic bailout systems have been proposed. CO2 monitoring is obviously red hot at the moment, improved reliability in oxygen sensors, and maybe even some small improvements in work of breathing will be possible. So let's say we can build a rebreather that is completely diver-proof. Of course, none of that will help with this problem of deep diving, gas density and respiratory issues we face. So my feeling is we've probably reached or even actually passed considerably the safe limit of depth for rebreather diving. I think this is a US Navy study that was a feasibility study into a 2,000 foot rebreather, which was published way back in the 70s, and a fan-forced component to actually push gas through the rebreather to decrease the work of breathing was proposed. And that's the only thing that I can think of which might improve this situation a little bit. But this actual unit is a surface-supplied apparatus, I think, feeding into the rebreather-style helmet, and very complex. And drive that motor for a period of time would require battery packs that we probably haven't got available. But if any of the manufacturers are interested in building something like that for us, we might be able to put it to some use. I'm glad that Leon actually mentioned this in his Reza talk, because I've been slowly working my way around the room, harassing the manufacturers and also talking to, emailing people in the past about this. But as someone who's involved in accident and fatality investigation, as part of my interest and my work, have some concerns about if a rebreather diver dies in South Australia, where I'm from. The first thing is that the South Australian Police Water Recovery Unit are going to get this rebreather, and they know nothing about rebreathers whatsoever. So they're going to call someone like myself who has some experience with rebreathers to help them analyse the unit. Now, if it's one of the couple of rebreathers I'm familiar with, I may be able to do a half reasonable job at that. But if it's one of the myriad units that I don't know anything about, then there's a fair chance I'm going to make a mess of it. And I know Martin Parker has published an extremely detailed step-by-step paper on how to analyse a rebreather after an accident or a fatality. And in the submarine trip that Andrew Fock and I were on in Turkey, where there was a near fatal accident, we used that paper to analyse the equipment, and it was enormously helpful. So my request would be to reinforce what the RESA group is asking for, is to preferably put in the public domain so that it's widely accessible for all the manufacturers to make a step-by-step analytical form, so that people out in the field can approach different units in a sensible and comprehensive way without missing vital information. That obviously benefits the rebreather community to work out what's gone wrong, and obviously benefits the manufacturers to avoid any false accusations of an equipment problem where most likely it's a diver error, or if there is a fault with the equipment, then that becomes more widely known. So that would be my one safety message for my talk. And I think that is the end. Thank you very much for your patience.